Good for me.
I always tell you as a standard ending for our little corner that we don't know where we're going to be next time. And most of the time, that's absolutely true. We don't plan too much in advance because we love that word serendipity. And that we got on our serendipity today, and it brought us up to 38 Couch Street in Plattsburgh to the home of our friend Keith Herkalo, not an unknown entity on this program. Keith, how are you, my friend?
I'm fine.
And the only reason he's here is because they're working on his bathroom.
That's true. So you may hear a clink here and there, or God forbid, a flood coming down from the ceiling.
No. This is a very informal program, as you know, so we don't mind extraneous sounds. We've had phones ring, people knocking on the door and coming in and wondering what's going to happen. We're here for a lot of reasons. First of all, every time we have a conversation with Keith, it's fascinating because he's interested in a lot of things. And he wants to share a lot of the things that he's learned with people in the North Country. The other night, we're recording this on whatever day this is, 22nd or 3rd? 23rd day of January, 2001. And 24th? 24th.
We're close.
Yeah.
It's the 24th.
Hey,
It's Wednesday.
We were within a day anyway. All right. I know it's the 25th tomorrow because I'm going to New Orleans tomorrow for a few days with Kate. But anyway, we're here to talk about history. The other night I sat down to figure out what I'd write for a column in the Press Republican for next Sunday, and I wrote about
The TV.
I wrote about historical
Oh, you
things.
did? I read about the TV. That was last week.
Well, that was repairing.
Okay.
Everything is a miracle with me.
Indeed.
But I started writing about history and the fact that how long I have decried the fact that we couldn't get the North Country as an entity, as a group of people to get excited about history. But thanks to people like Keith and other folks in this program and the Press Republican and lots of increasingly interesting commemorations of the Battle of Plattsburgh every year, I think we're turning the corner. And I feel good that programs like this and the fact that Herkalo shows up on the front page of the paper about every other day is helping to generate this passion for local history.
There are a lot of people interested.
And we have teachers in schools who are abandoning the normal history fair and talking about what happened in their backyard.
And they should.
And
they
they should. And I hear people in bars and on street corners and in restaurants talking about, oh, did you see something? Did you see that thing in the paper with Herkalo and the Royal Savage? Did you hear about the Pikes Cantonment? Did you hear about? The parents are coming home asking their parents about it. The parents don't have a clue, but they don't want to be ill-informed, and so they make an effort to find out.
True.
And it's beginning, don't you feel as though the whole thing's beginning to blossom and flower?
It is. And, excuse me, the state, unbeknownst to them, they're actually adding to the situation here and aiding and abetting our own efforts right here. The state has gone to something called document-based questioning, and they're looking for primary source data. So as we've spoken about before, we're also working with the North Country Teacher Resource Center to come up with curriculum for use in the local schools based on local documentation and first-hand documentation, original source data, not second or third-hand information. And that is coming out of the woodwork right now. People are beginning to say, gee whiz, my uncle so-and-so knew someone that did this or did that or something, and we wind up finding a document or being led to a document. And we're going to be working February the 14th, I believe, Valentine's Day. The North Country Teacher Resource Center, Gary Van Core, my good buddy, and Wayne Miller from the college, and the people at the North Country Teacher Resource Center are going to be putting together some materials. There will be a seminar on that day, and it's all to get the curriculum into the schools, and it's local curriculum, which is wonderful stuff.
That's what history is all about. And for anybody who might be viewing this program wherever you are, who believes that we have discovered all there is to discover about the history of this region, you couldn't be more than 4 billion miles from the truth, because almost every day something new turns up. We've talked to Keith lots of times. We talked to you standing in the rain along Route 22 south of Plattsburgh, and you said with an air of tremendous confidence, this was the site of Pike's Cantonment.
Absolutely.
Now, in retrospect, are you happy that you made that statement on that day? Have you confirmed it?
Absolutely. Yesterday, the 23rd, Tuesday, the 23rd of January, 2001, the Air Force called me. They are making plans to have their archaeological team back here in the North Country in April or May, depends on what the ground situation is. And they're bringing all of their sophisticated material back with them, all of their instruments, and they are going to go over the site based on the documentation that we have, which is firsthand, based on new documentation that I have from the Canadian archives that gives us an idea of how big the place was, and based on the research of the previous war, meaning the War of Independence, of the building techniques that were used then, we now know that the site of Pike's Cantonment was large enough to house some 2,000 to 4,000 troops. Murray came here in 1813 and destroyed the site, and we have a transcript of his report to the provincial government that states that it was large enough to accommodate 4,000 troops. Could this have been puffery on his part? The answer is yes. However, we also have the accounts of Dr. Mann and Dr. Beaumont, and those complete transcripts are available in the Canadian National Archives as well as here in this country. And reviewing those, we know we have between 2,000 and 4,000 troops. They could not have been at the top of a hill. They were, in fact, spread out all over the hill. And we know that that's happening, and the Air Force, as of yesterday, confirmed that their plans are in place, and they'll be bringing their archaeological team back here in April and May.
I haven't seen the sign move yet.
No, the sign, if you read the wording on the sign says near here. And that may sit the way it is right now. I'm not sure, but
We'll get a bigger and better one.
based on the archaeological information that comes out of this the survey that's going to be done this spring, based on that documentation, we're going to move forward with national landmark registration for the site itself, which will become a national landmark, i.e., the same as Valley Forge. Flip back the calendar. 1775. It was an encampment in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, some 7,000 troops, a little bit smaller here in Plattsburgh, 7,000 troops. They began to winter their troops, Washington did, in December of 1775. Our troops began to winter in December of 1812. They began to build log huts in December of 1775. Our troops began to build log huts in December of 1812. They wintered for several months there. That was Pennsylvania. You and I know what the North Country winters are like. They said they had a tough time in Pennsylvania. I submit they had a tougher time here.
Boy.
And these people were issued half blankets. They had a 3x3 square. They didn't have enough for full blankets. So the soldiers here, by the accounts that we have, first-hand accounts, these come from Dr. Mann and Dr. Beaumont, they had 3x3 squares for the soldiers. They slept in tents through December while they were building these log cabins. They always built the officers' places first, after they built the bakery and the hospital and those kinds of places. And they built them at the top of the hill, and progressively down the hill was the normal way of doing things back then. In 1775, the Quartermaster General wrote a letter to George Washington saying, in essence, "Grant that we may never find ourselves in such a wretched condition again." Well, history repeated itself in 1812. And here we are with Zebulon Pike, Zebulon Montgomery Pike, right here in Plattsburgh, the man for whom Pikes Peak was named. And he, just as the general in Pennsylvania, mustered the troops, kept their morale up. He was a charismatic leader and kept them going through that winter. And they were dying at the rate of 2 to 5 a week. So there are some 250 to 300 that have died right here in Plattsburgh, and we know absolutely not where they're buried at this point. History repeats itself.
But there's so much still to learn.
Absolutely.
And you've made some recent discoveries to confirm the location of Pike's Cantonment and to get into a whole another topic of conversation, because the War of 1812 is not the only battle that was fought around here.
True. Back to that Revolutionary War, we talked about George Washington, Benedict Arnold. Same war, different place, New York State, Lake Champlain, Valcour Island. Now what we have is in August of last year, or last part of August, early part of September, there was a phone call at my office on a Friday afternoon. And it was Mr. Ortloff on the phone, our assemblyman. And he said, Keith, I just had a call from Wayne Byrne. And he says that he has a piece of the Royal Savage. And we need to go and pick it up. And I said, fine, how big is it? He said, Wayne says it's about 8 feet long and it weighs several hundred pounds. And my statement, again, a Friday afternoon, it was about 3 o'clock. It's pouring rain outside. And I said, we'll make arrangements, get a couple people together. I wonder if it'll fit in my van. And he said, no, Wayne said, we have to get it now. And my statement to that was, why do we have to get it now? And the answer was that Mr. Byrne was moving from his house and it was in his garage. And the movers were in his driveway with the truck. And I made a couple quick phone calls, and lo and behold, the only person I could get a hold of was Jim Cochee. Jim Cochee was the president of the Battle of Plattsburgh Association. The word got out, and we'll meet you at Mr. Byrne's house. We pulled up outside, and sure enough, there's a big moving truck there. There's nothing left in the house. And in the garage is a single, solitary piece of wood. That's the only thing left, and that's it.
All right, hold it up here. Is that a good way to look at it? So what are we looking at?
Well, what you see here, Gordy, I'm going to tip this up if I can, and hopefully there's no glare on that. What we're looking at is actually two pieces of wood, and they're spiked together. And looking at this and knowing what I know about construction of vessels, these appear to be what are known as futtocks, F-U-T-T-O-C-K-S. These are parts of what's known as a frame. Now, when a boat is laid, there's a keel that's laid down the center, and then this thing called a frame goes in there. People call them ribs. In a larger vessel, it's impossible to get a huge piece of wood to make one complete rib, so they make it in pieces. And they tie it together in what's called a frame, and that frame rests on the keelson, which goes down the middle, and these frames are stacked up one after another, and then the planking goes around them. Well, this appears to be one of those sets of futtocks, and what they do is they put one piece in, and then they take another piece and sister it, put it beside the other piece. And they didn't have bolts per se back then. It was easier to use spikes, and they would drive a spike through and clinch the end of it and clamp them together, one piece over the opening of two other pieces, so that these were always paired. That's what we appear to have here. This appears to be from the contour of it and some of the markings on the bottom. For instance, the cutout that we see right here on the bottom, it appears to be a first and second futtock of one of the frames of the ship. Now, what ship? We were told that it was the Royal Savage, but as you and I know, to accept the statement is is not the most responsible thing to do. We need to the museum people call this process the provenance. Provenance, to find out where it came from, is it real, that kind of a thing. Wouldn't it be nice if you could take this piece of wood and just find the Royal Savage, because it has a break on the bottom, and plug that break into the opposing break on the Royal Savage? Well, I talked to Mr. Byrne, and I decided to get the story. I went out to interview him several weeks later after he got situated in his new apartment, he and his wife. And I sat down and talked with him, and his story goes that he received this from Mr. Seaton. Mr. Seaton had the southernmost portion of Valcour Island. That was his home camp, or his camp. He came from the New England states, and he summered here. And when he got to be elderly and couldn't take care of the place anymore, he had a daughter who he knew would not be able to take care of the place over the years, and he actually put the place up for sale. But in the meantime, Mr. Byrne had the place next to the Seatons. And the story from Mr. Byrne is that Mr. Seaton gave him this piece of timber and asked him to hold on to it until he was sure that he could give it to someone who could hold on to it. And that's pretty much the way the story goes. Well, now my interest is piqued even more, because I knew of the Seatons. And again, where's the Royal Savage? It would be a simple item if you could just take it and plug it in. And I do some digging around and find out that the Royal Savage supposedly is in Pennsylvania. Now, why is the Royal Savage in Pennsylvania? And I figured the most logical thing to do, this was a U.S. warship. It was actually captured from the British. I called the Department of the Navy in Washington, and I got this very strange and cryptic reply: you need to look in Pennsylvania, is in essence what the reply was. And I contacted the State Museum in Pennsylvania, who referred me to a museum that wasn't open, that wasn't built, that whose assets were in crates, and they had essentially no permanent staff save an executive director. Now, I did contact the executive director, who did not know what was in the collections. His only interest was in building the museum. It was over schedule, over budget. It was supposed to open in November of last year, and it was a Civil War museum. And why is the Royal Savage from 1776 being put in with a collection of material that is from the mid-1800s? You know, the Civil War took place in the 1860s. And that was very curious to me, but I was told that the overwhelming majority of the collection was Civil War in this museum, and they were going to call this museum the National Civil War Museum, and that they also had a very large collection of Wild West memorabilia.
Oh, wow. We'll plan a trip for next
And
summer.
that's on the opposite side of the scale. As you and I know, the Wild West didn't take place until after the Civil War.
Oh, sure.
You know, after the gold rush, or in that period of time, is when the Wild West came in. So we have both ends of the spectrum, and then somewhere in the middle was this Civil War museum, and he had no clue what I was speaking about when I mentioned the Royal Savage. So I left that one alone, and curiously enough, shortly thereafter, speaking with my good friend Mr. Pabst, and Frank says, well, you know, I know Hudson Hagland, and Bill Miller, who's a good buddy of his, lives down in Essex, Westport area, and Mr. Hagland is going to be here in November. And I said, Frank, is there any way that I could meet Mr. Hagland? And he said, well, maybe we can arrange something. You know, maybe we'll, you know, he likes to go out to dinner every now and then. Maybe we can come up with a dinner. Well, as you know, the dinner just kind of grew and grew and grew. And Bill Miller had some, he took the photographs, the actual footage. This was movie film in 1935 of the raising of the Philadelphia, which Lorenzo Haglund, his father, had filmed, and Bill Miller made it into video. And suddenly the story grew even more and more. And as you know, there was a dinner with almost 100 people at the Royal Savage Inn, in which Mr. Haglund narrated the video of the raising of the Philadelphia and spoke about the Royal Savage. Now, at that point in time, I didn't want to ask how the Royal Savage wound up in this museum. But as in the course of the evening and in speaking with Mr. Haglund on Saturday, the day before, Friday and Saturday, he left Plattsburgh with the statement that he couldn't promise anything, but that he would see what he could do when he left here. And lo and behold, we find out that the actual pieces of the Royal Savage, about 8% of it, were sold to the museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And although I haven't been in contact with the museum myself, there are such things as intermuseum transfers and intermuseum loans, and who knows what happens. Our interest solely is in verifying that this piece of wood matches piece for piece, molded in sided dimensions, which means one side and the other side, and those are sailor terms, and is the same type of material, both in metal and in wood, and the composition. And again, wouldn't it be nice if I could take a mold of that one broken piece and fit it in with a piece of the Royal Savage as is in Pennsylvania? There's only about 8% of the Royal Savage that's in Pennsylvania, and at some time, this is a photograph that was provided to the Associated Press by the mayor's office in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And as you can see there's a part of the keel and part of the keelson, which is the bottom of the boat, several pieces of timber, which look surprisingly like the piece that we have, and some planking. That's all that exists of the wood, but they also purchased buttons and musket balls and possibly some other things, plates and silverware, or pewterware, excuse me, not silverware. And the story goes on and on and on. Lo and behold, people in the North Country are coming forward and saying, we have heard of other pieces. And I've been given a clue that there's a piece of the Royal Savage in the Canadian National War Museum. Some pieces that were taken out of the lake and went north of here in the 60s and 70s, and were on display in the island in Montreal and then transferred to the Canadian National War Museum. Wouldn't it be nice if the Battle of Plattsburgh Association, once the museum is up and running, can seek a return or a temporary or permanent loan from the Canadian National War Museum, and or also the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. But in the meantime, we have things that are coming to us. Mr. Haglund has sent along some photographs.
First of all, let's
Go
stop
ahead.
for a moment
Yes.
and talk about Haglund. How did Hudson Haglund's father end up here, and what was he doing dragging things out of Lake Champlain?
I hear
Let's
you.
just fill in the blanks here.
Wonderful story. The man's name is Lorenzo Haglund. Lorenzo Haglund came here in 1917 as part of the Officer Training Corps for World War I. While he was here, he heard about many of the wrecks that were in the lake, and in fact, the well-known cartographer, Mr. Stoddard, local boy here, published a map in the late 1800s, which showed the absolute location. And in fact, the guidebooks that were done way back then actually listed the site of the Royal Savage and told people in low water, take your boat out there and look, because you can see the remains of the Royal Savage in 20 feet of water, off the southern end of Valcour Island. It was a tourist attraction. It was listed in the brochures, some of which we do have now, and it's on the Stoddard map. I have a Stoddard map listed, thanks to Helen Ionelli, by the way. Helen, thank you very much for giving that to me. She's a wonderful lady, and she came in one day to the office, a little aside, and said, "Do you have one of these?" And I said, "No, I don't." And she brought back two, one for the city, which is in the city's files, and one for me. And Helen, thank you very much. The point of the Royal Savage is shown right on the map, on Stoddard's map. Well, Mr. Hagland was impressed with this, and he always remembered it, because when he was here, he read about the battle, and he read about the Royal Savage, and he read about many of the other things that happened here in Lake Champlain. He was impressed. He came back here in 1929. Now he's a marine engineer, a salvage engineer. He came back here with the Underwater Metal Cutting Company from New York City, and they were working on the bridge down south of here. And while they were working on the footing, they found some artifacts.
That'd be Crown Point?
The Crown Point Bridge. And his crew, they were hard hat divers, the big blow-up rubber suit and the nutty little brass helmet with the 4 pieces of glass in there. Excuse me. And the men that were diving for him, and he himself, who was a diver, they found some artifacts. And he immediately started some discussion with the people at Ticonderoga, at the fort then, the museum as it was known then, and the New York State Museum, and said, we have found some artifacts. I would like to come back and do some more research. I would like to form an expedition. And he did that from 1929 until 1934. And in 1934, he believed that he had everything in place for the raising of the Royal Savage. It had been tried time and time again. It was tried in the 60s, 1860s that is. It was tried in the 1880s. It was tried for the tercentenary celebration in the early 1900s. No one could raise it. Hudson Hagland was a marine engineer. He knew how to do that. He took pitch barrels and he filled them with water. These were essentially 55-gallon drums as you and I know them today. He filled them with water, he put them on the bottom, he put a sling around the bottom of the Royal Savage remains, and then he took the air hose, the spare air hose that was supplied with the diving suit, and he filled up the barrels, displacing the water with air. Suddenly, the entire remains of the Royal Savage become buoyant, and they slowly rise to the surface. Very much the same method as we used here to raise the bateau floor. Again, these timbers were waterlogged. They're very soft, very pliable. You don't want to stress them in one area or another. We did the same thing. We used the same technique. Instead of barrels, we used foam to make it just a little bit buoyant, and slowly it rose right to the top, and there it is. Well, while he's here in 1934, he turns around and he raises the Royal Savage. And here's a picture that was given to me by his son, Mr. Hudson Hagland, who we met in November. And he provided us with a copy of the photograph. Well, this is the actual photograph, period, of the remains of the Royal Savage in Seaton's Bay. Remember Mr. Seaton? He confirmed that his father used Seaton's Bay as the staging area for removing all these items onto the beach. And he carefully took the pieces and he labeled each one with a brass number, and they were taken out of the water and put in one area. Now there was no treatment back then at that point in time. Well, while he's searching around in 1934, he's also doing some more work while he's here during the summer of 1934. And he's looking for Benedict Arnold's gunboats because he knows that there are 2 missing. So he searches around, and he doesn't find anything, but he comes back here in 1935. And sure enough, in 1935, he finds an intact Philadelphia, the gunboat. And he uses the same techniques from the year before to raise the Philadelphia, one of the most inclusive finds of colonial material in the nation at the time and since. He raised it from the bottom in one piece. It was scuttled, the Philadelphia was sunk. It had a hull shot, but it sank straight to the bottom. Its mast still standing erect, and we have photographic evidence of it. We have pictures, not only still pictures, still photographs, but we have moving pictures. He brought back a cinematographer with him, and we now have that on video. It's been transferred from one media to the next. Well, Hudson Hagelin sent all kinds of photographs. Now he's got two artifacts. His father does, Lorenzo. He has the remains of the Royal Savage, and he has the gunboat Philadelphia. New York State Museum says, well, we have no place for those. And you can imagine what Lorenzo Hagelin was going through at the time. He thought that apparently he had everything worked out with the State Museum, so he's told all of a sudden that there's no room for this at the State Museum. There's no support for these two items that he's brought to the surface, so he turns to the state of Vermont. And the University of Vermont, he starts discussion with them about generating a museum on the waterfront in Burlington. Those plans fall through. He talks to the state of Vermont. Those plans fall through. And suddenly he has nowhere to go. The federal government won't help him. The state government of New York, the university system of Vermont, or the state of Vermont, none of those people would help. So Lorenzo Hagelin has now an intact warship and the remains of Benedict Arnold's flagship and no place to put them. So he takes the Philadelphia and he puts it on a flat barge and he treats it such that he can move it around, and he makes it a living school exhibit. He travels up and down Lake Champlain trying to build support for a museum and at the same time generating some photographs and selling postcards to raise money. Mr. Hagelin, Hudson Hagelin, sent us one of the postcards that his father had made. They sold the postcards to raise money for a new museum. In the summer months, he traveled to Lake Champlain giving educational tours. In the winter, the Philadelphia went south into the Hudson River for the winter, and they did some things down there with it. He could never raise the money. He brought it back here, and suddenly they had a corporation going. And this was in the late 50s. And they sold 300 shares of stock to come up with a new museum. They couldn't raise the money. The Philadelphia was placed on the roadside down at Ausable Chasm. In the meantime, Mr. Lorenzo Hagelin raised the 1809 steamship Ticonderoga. For those historians, you remember that the Ticonderoga was the first steamship built on Lake Champlain, and McDonough actually had eyes on using that ship and removing the steam engine from it, but he never wound up doing that.
Didn't we have also the Vermont? Wasn't that a steamship
That's
also?
correct,
In the
yeah.
early 1800s.
Raised and put down at the same place. This was 135 feet long. They put it on the side of the road at Ausable Chasm, along with the remains of the Philadelphia, along with the remains of the Royal Savage, and then he goes to Arnold's Bay, Button Bay, and raises the remains of another gunboat. He has 4 vessels now. He's trying to raise enough money to get a museum started. He can't get enough going. It turns into a bust, this corporation that he had, and he finally dies in 1961. Nobody would listen to him, and then the Smithsonian steps in and says, well, we'll verify that the Arnold gunboat, the second boat that he found from that period of time, is the genuine article, comparing it to the Philadelphia, which was the genuine article. And the Smithsonian stepped in and said that they would take the Philadelphia back to Washington, and it now sits on the top floor of the Smithsonian Science Museum. The remains of the Royal Savage were put into crates and stored at the Hudson Hagelin, or the Hagelin properties in Willsboro and or Westport. I'm not exactly sure where they were. And we have a picture of them in the barn, by the way, which was sent to us. A piece of one of the burnt timbers. It's a little hard to see, but this appears to be one of the masts. As you can see, there are some devices here where the rigging would have gone around, and that appears to be one of the masts. They couldn't raise enough money to generate a museum, and unfortunately, there was a campground scheduled for across from the Ausable Chasm. And through the years, from that period of time until the museum was built, or the campgrounds were built somewhere in the 70s, souvenir hunters went and tore hunks of the pieces off, hunks of the boats off. And then when it came time to actually build this, from what I'm told, everything was bulldozed. Now, history repeats itself. Remember that statement about Pike's Cantonment and Valley Forge. Grant that we may never be in such a wretched condition again. Here we are in the 2000s, and grant that we may never be in such a wretched position again. Hudson Haglund tried for 30 years to get a museum started. Here we are in 2000 trying to get a museum going to put these artifacts in. We need your help. We need the state of Vermont. We need the state of New York. We need the federal government. And we're trying everything that we can to get the local population interested in what's going on here. And Mr. Haglund is doing his part, thank goodness. He's sending us materials. He's filling in the blanks for us. And the Battle of Plattsburgh Association, again, our main charter is to interpret the War of 1812, but a corollary to that is to build this military history museum in the stone barracks on the old base.
Won't that be nice? This photograph was in the Press Republican.
That's an AP photograph, Associated Press, and that is a piece of a timber, and that is among the collection at the Royal Savage Inn. Now, I was home in the first week in January. I was telling you about this little operation I had, and previous in November, a gentleman called me at the office at City Hall, and he said, "I have a piece of the Royal Savage for you, but I'm going on vacation, and I'll call you when I come back." And then we'll continue.
And miraculously, as though you had never left your chair, the camera starts again, and the piece is, lo and behold, sitting
magic
in front of you on the table.
It's
okay,
magic.
Tell me about it.
A gentleman named Bill Bowen called me in November and said, "I'm going on vacation, but when I get back, I'll get in touch with you. I have a piece of the Royal Savage. It's been in my family for years." And January, he shows up here at my door with this. Now, this is very fragile, but it appears to be a piece of oak, which is very similar to the oak that we show in those photographs right there. The size of these bored holes are very similar to the bored holes in the others. And again, that question is provenance. How do we prove this? He also brought some material with him from his family, and I'll read what it says here. Mr. Carl Banker of Keysville helped find fragments of the ship the Royal Savage. This is one of the fragments he brought home. Mr. Banker died December 1975. His wife gave me this piece of the Royal Savage. This is from Mr. Bowen's mother. And along with it, she has a statement, a little piece of paper, which she tucked inside one of the holes, and it says, "The Haglunds at Valcour Island, 1934. And there was a little piece of a newspaper that says, "In the story of the wreck raiders' dive off Valcour Island this weekend, it was said that the restoration of the ship Royal Savage was in the Smithsonian Institute. In fact, it's the ship Philadelphia which is in the Smithsonian. The Royal Savage was burned and only fragments remain."
Now, the wreck raiders, for those people who might be viewing and don't know, was Frank Papp's diving crew.
Ooh.
From way back when, and they did a lot of work on the lake.
Indeed. And what's nice is that those gentlemen, and I don't know if there are any ladies attached at that point in time, but many of those gentlemen are now coming forward, and they're expressing great interest in what's happening here, and that's wonderful. And again, what we're trying to do is authenticate this piece of material and the piece that we have in our holdings over on the base right now, which is the futtocks here. And Mr. Haglund has been wonderful about sending photographs and other materials, and he promises to continue with that. So we're actually sitting here generating the core of an exhibit about the Royal Savage. Are we ever going to have the complete boat? No, the answer is it burned to the ground, it burned to the waterline. But I liken it to the United States flag. You know, the United States flag is nothing but a piece of cloth when you look at it, but it's this symbolism that you attach to it. It takes on a different meaning. The Royal Savage is nothing but a piece of wood with metal spikes in it at this point, but it was the beginning of our United States Navy. So it's what we actually attach to that as far as worth that makes it so interesting to us. And it's just a wonderful piece of our American heritage and our North Country heritage.
So Hudson Hagelin, we've got to thank for a lot of things. I want to show people a picture of Hudson Hagelin leaving Valcour for Long Island, 1934.
Absolutely.
Isn't that neat?
Absolutely. He's got some wonderful stories to tell, and he's continuing to provide information with us.
That would have been.
Us.
Was he born then? That would have been his dad, Lorenzo.
That was his dad, Lorenzo. That's correct. Okay. Now he remembers many of the people in the local area, and even as a little child, working with his dad. You know, he wasn't able to do a whole lot then, but he remembers some of the people. And over the years, several of them have gotten in touch with him, and he has some wonderful stories to tell. He's a little guarded, and I guess that's good. But he's been very forthcoming with us at this point, and he's very interested that the community here in Plattsburgh is interested in what his father tried to do, and it's going to be nice to actually tell that whole story and to see Mr. Hagelin's, Lorenzo Hagelin's, to see his desire for a North Country museum come to fruition under the Battle of Plattsburgh Association auspices. A wonderful thing.
Now, I'm sure that there are people who are watching this program who may remember this 1935 bit, and if so, would they be willing to supply the information they have with your organization? I'm sure they would.
Wonderful. We'd love to see any materials that they do have. We'd love to complete the story. Mr. Hagelin is not a young gentleman. For that matter, neither am I or you. But every day that we wait, every day that passes, not only the material gets a day older, not only we get a little day older, but the story gets a day older and sometimes gets forgotten or clouded over the period of time. And it would be nice to get those stories together so that they don't get lost. And what's really interesting is that Mr. Hagelin is willing to, based on what the community is doing here, he is very interested in passing on the information that he has and bringing it here to the North Country as opposed to somewhere else.
So 2001 could be a good year for this whole thing, right?
Absolutely, it will be. And, we'll just continue to grow.
There's another reason, if you can believe, there is another reason for us being here today, which takes us back to the Battle of Plattsburgh and the War of 1812. And as I wrote in my little column, which I don't know when it'll be in the paper in a week or so, what a pleasure it is to be friends with a guy, excuse me, like Keith Herkalo, who is willing to share his enthusiasm in local history and to put his talent where his mouth is. This guy is an expert researcher, and if you weren't when you started, you're becoming more so just by dint of doing it.
I'm surprising myself, Gordy. I really am.
Because you have to start somewhere. When you're looking for something, you have to start with a phone call or a website, and or an address or the name of one person, and it just blossoms as it goes.
You just have to be a good amateur detective, is the way it comes out. You have to be able to look at things in more than one way. You have to be able to look at information and say, what if? What if this happens, or what if that happened, or what happens if you take the information and put it in a different context? Will it lead me anywhere? And many times it doesn't. In fact, 90% of the time it doesn't. But if you're willing to stick to it, then all of a sudden the next step begets the next step begets the next step, and you start out with something that looks kind of like a cloud, and then all of a sudden it just kind of goes together in a single point. And sure enough, we were talking about Pike's Cantonment earlier. Back last summer, I was speaking with a gentleman from California. His name is Richard House. And he stopped in at City Hall, he and his local friend here, and he asked me if I knew anything about the Vermont militia. Well, I knew a little bit about the Vermont militia, and as you know, we've been researching the Pikes Cantonment area for 6 years at that point in time, so I knew a little bit more than was necessary to answer his question, let's put it that way. And he told me that his relative was in the Vermont militia, and I relayed to him the story. You know, many of us know about what happened on the lake here in 1814, and Commodore McDonough certainly garnered the praise of the nation, but no less important was what happened on the land here. You have to remember that there were more troops here than there were more British troops than were at Detroit, than were at New Orleans, than were at Baltimore. There were some 15,000 British regulars massed on the Canadian border for an invasion here at Plattsburgh. This was the big enchilada right here. And they had a two-pronged attack in mind. Prevost called for a naval attack on the lake, and he also called for a land attack in Plattsburgh here. You remember a year earlier, a gentleman named Murray came here, and he was absolutely unopposed, came into Plattsburgh and burned the blockhouse, burned many of the local residences here. They plundered several of the stores, and they burned what was left of this cantonment area, which was known as Pikes Cantonment. So they expected to be meeting with a cakewalk here, but just in case, they managed to feign something on the western end. And what they did was they came up with a false attack to the west of us here, Sackett's Harbor. And General Izard, our general, ordered the regular troops from Plattsburgh to go to Sackett's Harbor and west to defend the western area. This was all a ruse to open up this area. Plattsburgh was left with 1,500 regular Army troops. But these were the people that couldn't march because they were sick, they were injured, they were bakers, they were office people. You know, they were people that don't normally carry a weapon. So there were 1,500 of them. The local community here had the militia. That's all that was here. There were 15,000 British troops right off the boats from the Napoleonic Wars. These were the best that Europe had to offer, and they were 17 miles north of us here. So they started to come in, and they were, again, unopposed. In the meantime, McDonough was doing wonderful things on the water here, but then there was this fella named General Macomb. A General Macomb and his other general, General Moores. And General Moores was actually the more senior of the two, but they kind of split the duties. General Moores took the militia, and General Macomb took the regular troops. General Macomb ordered the 3 forts to be built. Many people think that the forts were built before the British got here. That's not true. They were built in the summer and the late fall or late spring of 1814 because they were expecting that something might happen. The forts weren't finished. So Macomb and Moores ordered that the forts be finished. Now, these weren't forts as you and I think of forts. These were big sand redoubts, which means big piles of sand. They worked with shovels and they piled up the sand. And they got inside and they put pickets on the outside so that the troops couldn't come across. And they were defending the inside. There were so few troops here that the order was issued by Moores to defend. Each group of soldiers was given a fort to defend, and they had to defend that to the very last man because there was no help coming, and that's essentially what he told them in his order. Now, Pikes Cantonment, where does that all fit in? The British had a grand plan, and their plan was, yes, they knew about the forts because they had their own spies. Yes, they knew that they could come in on the water, and they were very confident that they were going to destroy McDonough's troops. But just for the heck of it, they were going to plan an end run. They were going to come in way outside the village of Plattsburgh, over now where 87 crosses the Saranac River. And they were going to bring their troops down that area, General Robertson, and bring the British troops across the river and attack the forts from the south. That was the plan. We know that's the plan. We have the British documents to prove that. What we needed to do was find out what happened at Pike's Cantonment. Back to Mr. House. Mr. House says, what about the militia? This is last summer. And I told him that the Vermont militia was here in Plattsburgh. They knew what was happening in Plattsburgh. They knew that Plattsburgh had very little defense. So many of them defied the governor of Vermont and actually came here to fight on this side of the lake. Mr. House goes back to California and he requests from the National Military Records his relatives' pension papers. And I want to read you a statement from the pension papers of Albern Hoose, H-O-O-S-E.
Wow.
These are dated in the mid-1800s. And he says, I, James Talcott, this is an affidavit that went along with it, of Williston, Vermont, age 60 years, and he goes on to say that he was chosen as the captain of this particular group of people from Vermont. We marched that same day to Burlington, Vermont, where we organized. I was chosen as captain of said company and accepted the office. We drew guns from Arthur Bostwick, the quartermaster of Burlington, and on that day, leaving Williston, we crossed Lake Champlain and landed about 1.5 miles south of Plattsburgh Village, where we encamped. And on the evening of the 11th of September, 1814, the morning, we marched to Pike's Cantonment. Absolute positive proof that this gentleman's relative was at Pike's Cantonment, where we were received into the United States service, given rations and ammunition, and were immediately ordered to guard an ammunition wagon. They were set upon.
What year?
This particular piece was written in the mid-1800s to an affidavit.
What year did they march to the?
1814, the day of the battle.
There wasn't anything left there, was there?
But that's where the British were crossing the river,
Yeah.
remember?
But it already had been burned by Murray's
Already
raiders.
been burned.
Okay.
But again, the British knew from being there a year ago that this was the most opportune place to cross the river. And there's my phone.
All right, we're rolling again.
Rolling again.
So that pinpoints the crossing that you had already told us about a long time ago.
What's more important, Gordy, is it, again, back to that primary source documentation. We have a first-hand account from a survivor of the period who says that he was the captain of an outfit from Vermont, the Vermont militia, who came to Plattsburgh specifically to Pike's Cantonment. That places a first-hand account of the Vermont militia at Pike's Cantonment. The story gets better.
I can hardly wait. It's a good thing you don't say continued tomorrow because we got to do this all today.
Oh boy.
All right.
Now you remember sometime back we talked about Aiken's volunteers.
I know you and I have, and hopefully our viewers will understand. If they don't, we're going to explain it to them. We're going to tell you all about what Aiken's volunteers were and what they did for us around that time, way back when on September 8th.
September the 3rd is when they actually started.
Okay.
Now remember, when the British came south from the border, again, by the time they arrived here, they left troops in various locations along with military stores. So the 15,000 troops that were massed over the border, by the time they got here, they were somewhere from 11 to 12,000 troops that were in this area. At least that's the way the current numbers go. And there's some question as far as the absolute number, but that's irrelevant at this point. You have to remember that there were 1,500, that's it, American troops. There were some 350 regular militia, meaning people in the area who agreed to submit to military orders of a gentleman who they elected to be one of their leaders, and they would take orders from the supreme commander, who turned out to be General Moores or General McComb. who supposedly were the professionals and knew how to fight. And then there were the Vermont militia, some 250 strong. That's it. There were 10 to 12,000 British troops coming down. As soon as September the 3rd came, again, the regular troops had all gone west to Sackett's Harbor. Nobody's left. The British start marching across the border. It worked. They're ready to move. So they come across the border, and as they're coming across the border, of course, the local population here says, now what do we do? You know, all our troops are gone. There's nobody left to guard the area. So what they did is they all moved south of the Saranac River. The people in the village here moved south of the Saranac River. They were out of their homes. They stored whatever they could store. They took whatever they could take. They tried to hide whatever they could hide, and they left their homes. They literally walked away from their homes, and they moved to the south side of the river.
All right, we're underway.
And getting from Plattsburgh, you remember that here in the village of Plattsburgh, the people abandoned their houses. And the people north of us here in Chazy and Champlain, they tried to hide whatever they could. Many of them did not leave their homes. They stayed in their homes. As non-combatants, they expected to be left alone. They expected that they may have to provide for the troops as they went through, but many of them stayed in their homes. Here in the village, however, which was the primary military target, the answer was nobody stayed in their homes. They all moved south of the village. Well, if you were a young child and your home was taken away from you, and you knew that you were facing, in essence, a disaster, wouldn't you want to defend your village? And that's exactly what happened. There were 15 people, and they were young. They were 15, 16, 17-year-olds. They were too young for the military, and they volunteered. They went to General McComb, General Moores, and said, we'd like to fight. And what happened was the generals said to them, if you can find an officer that is willing to be your leader, we will allow you to do that. And enter Martin Aiken and Azariah Flagg, a lieutenant. Captain Aiken from south of here in Essex area, I believe, and Azariah Flagg right here from Plattsburgh. And they were the two officers, and they were issued rifles at some point in time. But September the 3rd, the first official duty that they had was to march north. These 15 kids marched north to Chazy to meet up with the New York State militia.
Oh, see, I didn't even know that until today.
Well, now, very interesting. I've been tracking the volunteers, the families of the volunteers, and I managed to find the family of H.K. Averill, who was 16 years old at the time. And I've been talking to them over a period of months. And as you know, Gordy, and maybe many of your listeners have heard, to commemorate the extreme gift that these children actually provided to the local area, Congress issued a rifle to them in 1829. And prior to this, there were 4 known to exist. And one of the things that would be nice is to try to track all 15 of those down. And I found 6 now. But one of them is in the hands of the Averill family. But more important than the rifle to me at this point is that they had a diary. I heard that they had a diary. And for 9 months I was talking to the people, and they said that they would try to see what they could do about getting me a copy of it. And I had all kinds of visions of it being the ramblings of a lovesick 16-year-old kid. And it turns out it's not, because just before Christmas, I got a present in the mail. And the present is a photocopy of the journal. Again, primary source document. It's a photocopy, some 94 pages worth, starting in 1818. Now, why 1818?
Yeah, why
Very
18?
Curious. If you start to read this, which is very hard to read, it's a very poor photocopy, but you start to read it and you find out that there was a commemoration of the battle on September the 11th, in 1815, in 1816, in 1817, and all of a sudden in 1818, there was no celebration, no commemoration of the battle. And this gentleman, who was now 20 years old, said, essentially, I'm mad. I'm mad that you're not commemorating what happened here in Plattsburgh and in the North Country, and I'm going to sit down so that the story won't get lost. I'm going to write it all down. And the first 8 or 9 pages, Gordy, are an account of what Aiken's volunteers, those 15 kids, did during the Battle of Plattsburgh from September the 3rd until September the 13th. In that period of time, everywhere they went, what they did, who they talked to, where they fought, and again, documentary evidence, first-hand account. They went first to Chazy. From Chazy, they went to Beekmantown. They came into Halsey's Corners. General McComb was using them to reconnoiter the enemy. Who would suspect a 15-year-old kid, a farm kid? And they were actually going out and spying on the enemy. And they were coming back and reporting to General Moores and General McComb. We have that firsthand. Trying to corroborate, much the same as we're corroborating the timbers of the Royal Savage, trying to corroborate the information that's in this diary with other documents. We also have an address that was given by a gentleman named St. John B.L. Skinner, who was another one of these kids back on the bridge here in Bridge Street. They defended the bridge on September the 6th here, and corroborating the accounts of one to the other. H.K. Averill was the nephew of Betsy DeLord, the Kent DeLord house. Betsy's parents were the DeLord family. The Kent family was also related. All these people appear in the diary here. And what we have is a first-hand account and another first-hand account by St. John B.L. Skinner. And again, Mr. Hoose, remember Mr. House is now his name. He sent me a copy of a book that was printed in 1836. It was a history, the Brackenridge history of the war between the two great nations. Another attempt in 1836 to tell the history of what was happening here, but the accounts go one for one. Also in here, we find out that the Aiken volunteers were actually at Pike's Cantonment. We didn't know that before. They tell us that they crossed at Thorns. Now we know where Thorns is. If I can find the map, I'll show it to you. Now we remember where Pike's Cantonment was. I'm going to leave this. Can I do this upside down? Is that helpful? Pike's Cantonment area, and again, the maps were not very good then. This was the best attempt that they could make. But the map this was done in the mid-1800s, but it's not like a map today. We know that Pike's Cantonment area is in Lot 66, which is right here. Well, we have a first-hand account that says on September the 11th, 1814, General McComb asked Aiken's volunteers to go and annoy the picket guard to the west end of their territory. So these fellows crossed the bridge, across the river, at a place called Thorns. Well, guess where Thorns is? It's to the west of the Pike's Cantonment area. It's a little bit below Morrisonville. It's actually at Schuyler Falls. Well, they crossed at Thorns, which was the west end, just about where Schuyler Falls is, and they got across the river at that point, and the guard was no longer there. They had abandoned the actual location. So Captain Aiken took them on the south side of the river, headed back toward the village, and they heard the gunfire at that point. So they are actually on the enemy's right flank. He tells us that. Lo and behold, the Vermont militia are coming in from Port Jackson, which is now Peru. We have a first-hand account by Mr. Hoose. His relative, the Captain Talcott, in the affidavit is telling us that they came up by the lakeside, and we now have a matching piece of information that says that the Vermont militia was on the left side of the enemy as they were crossing the river. But we also have General Moore's accounts that tell us that he established a headquarters at the Salmon River Settlement. The Salmon River Settlement, if you go back into the town of Plattsburgh records, you find out that the Salmon River Settlement is due south of Pike's Cantonment, where we know it to be today. There was a roadway that connected the two together. And what happened when the British crossed the river, we have first-hand account again, they crossed the river, and if they knew where they were going, they would have made a left-hand turn, headed east, and went right for the forts. But they didn't do that. The Vermont militia, the New York militia under General Moore's, and the Aikens volunteers on their right flank were leading them away from the village of Plattsburgh. They were retreating toward the Salmon River Settlement, 4 miles back from Lake Champlain. They were actually leading the British down a road, so to speak, figuratively and literally, leading them away from the river. Now, the British fought by standing in a straight line. The first rank would fall down on their knee, the second rank would stand up, and they would fire in volleys. These are kids that shot squirrels and rabbits for their dinner. They fought from behind trees and rocks. The Vermont militia did the same thing. These were farmers. And the New York militia was to the south, egging them on, backing away from the village of Plattsburgh. The British didn't have a clue, and they didn't have the wherewithal to find out what was going on. And in fact, they were being led down a rosy path to destruction. And we can prove that now with the document that we do have. More important, for later on, this is a period, a snapshot of the entire local area and the social culture of the Delord family, the Kent family, the Averill family, the Skinner family, all of those local people here, the Palmers, all of those local people at the time for a period of 4 years, and it tells us what they did for a living, it tells us how they interacted socially, it tells us about the court system, it tells us about people and how they interreacted family to family, what they did during a long wintered nights, those kinds of things. It's a wonderful, wonderful snapshot, and it's something that's never been published.
It wasn't very long ago when we didn't know it existed.
That's true.
And now we do, and it's 94 pages, and you and I have talked about the possibility of getting it published for the benefit of this whole promulgation of interest in history here in the Plattsburgh area. So that would be nice. And Keith, by the time this is aired, you might have the permission to get it published. And wouldn't that be neat? All of us would like to have a good version of it so that we can pour through it as you have. Have you read the whole thing?
I've read the whole thing.
I should have known.
It took a while to get through it. It's written in Old English, and it's a very poor copy. But it's a copy nonetheless. After you get into it for a while, then you get the rhythm, you begin to recognize how the gentleman speaks, you get to recognize the names so that when you see the same name in a different place, whether it's a poor copy of the name in the pen at that point in time, you can in fact move one to the other and say with great certainty that this is the name you're looking at. And I took the liberty of using a light pencil and going over some of the lines so I could actually read the thing. And what's happened since is, after reading all of this and coming to the conclusion that if we can authenticate the volume itself, and I'm fairly well convinced at this point that we have the genuine article here because of its tie-in with the other accounts, and there's nothing that conflicts. If we can in fact confirm that this particular volume, wouldn't it be nice if we could publish that for the benefit of the local understanding of the War of 1812 and the national understanding of the War of 1812 and this wonderful group of kids called Aikens Volunteers. And I've been in touch with the family, and I have a tentative answer as of yesterday, and the family is going to get together essentially and make a decision. And what we're asking them to do is allow the Battle of Plattsburgh Association to publish the journal with whatever proceeds that come out of it to benefit the museum or whatever collection of their choice that would go in the museum here when it gets built. And that's kind of where we're at right now.
You know, I want to point out here, as long as we're in the middle of this discussion, that for those people who are learning a little bit about the Battle of Plattsburgh, so-called Battle of Plattsburgh, or the Battle of Lake Champlain, as perhaps it's more appropriately called, there's lots more to learn. We focused on certain areas today based on Keith's research. Let our viewers know that Calvin and I, and even before I became involved in our little corner, done a lot of video focusing on other areas that were involved too. I think those people who watch this program today should know by now that there was more to this whole episode, this whole thing in this area than just that one battle on Lake Champlain.
Absolutely.
He's pointed out many areas. Our various other experts and people who were related to people who lived around this area during the War of 1812 have talked us not only to the border, but we've gone up into Canada and learned an awful lot about what different groups formed all those men that came south, what they did north of the border, what they got, what a diverse, interesting group. As you said, they were a lot of British regulars, but
Yes.
There were some other groups. There were Canadians involved. There
That's
was
correct.
that wild group. What were they called again? With the
Voltigeurs.
Voltigeurs with those
Voltigeurs.
crazy big hats that came down
And
through.
the Dragoons were specifically an outfit that was that came from Canada, I believe, and there were many other outfits involved. The local population here, there were militia from Chazy, there were conflicts in Beekmantown. In fact, there's a cemetery in Beekmantown with mostly young people that died at the conflict on the Beekmantown Road there, out by, what's the name of the road there? It begins with Ashley Road, the Ashley Road Cemetery. Have your viewers go up and take a walk through that cemetery sometime and see the 18, 19, and 20-year-olds that defended that road and died right there, stopping the British invasion at that point. And then our good friend Lynn Wilkie yesterday, we were trying to talk about the New York State militia, and we now have a first-hand account of the Peru militia. And they are, with the new attention of Lynn Wilkie, they're trying to form a group to participate in the summer festivities here in the commemoration, and come up with a Peru militia, because we now have first-hand accounts dealing with the Peru militia, and they were actually from Peru and went to the Salmon River area and defended the south of Pike's Cantonment. And it's all fitting together with this crazy patchwork quilt. But all the pieces are beginning to make sense now.
That's really nice. Calvin and I have spent a lot of time up around Dewey's Tavern because we love that area. It played a very important role in the history of the Battle of Plattsburgh and that whole time period here. And we went up there and we stood on that ground and looked around, and we were told that one of the cemeteries up there was actually, they wanted to move it or they wanted to do some housing. Can't remember what happened, but there are cemeteries there that haven't been preserved, and that's what makes us so mad, because we're trying to recover these things, and some other folks are trying to plow them under. But there were connections with Chazy, big time connections with George Hubbell's family in Chazy, and he's got the old newspaper articles that one of his ancestors did an interview.
Julius Caesar Hubble.
Julius Caesar Hubble did,
yes.
and he did this interview in the Plattsburgh newspaper, like when he was like in the 1880s, right, Calvin? But his memory of what happened was absolutely sterling, about bets that went on up there, and about how they rode, knock on the door, come on, we'll ride down to Plattsburgh and watch this battle. And
Yes, and being out on Cumberland Head, it was almost a festive atmosphere. From some of the accounts that we have, people put a basket lunch together and went out and sat on Cumberland Head to watch the battle. Let me read one portion of it for your viewers, and it deals with the Sampson's Tavern. And Sampson's Tavern is about 8 miles north of us here from Plattsburgh. It says, after the company sounded the alarm we renewed our march and arrived at Culver's Hill about 1 o'clock p.m., where General Moores was posted with a body of militia amounting to about 250. Now, this is New York militia. He requested Captain Aiken to strike through the woods into the east road and annoy the enemy's flank, which we had heard were driving upon that road. Accordingly, we proceeded as far as the James Brooks, and it appears to be a Brooks or a Crooks. I haven't been able to pin that down, where we met a company of militia just retiring from the road, who informed us that the enemy had advanced as far as Sampson's Tavern, 8 miles from Plattsburgh. So they were well north of Plattsburgh, some 8 to 10 miles north, and this period of time was September 3rd and the 4th, and they talk about being in touch with General Moores and moving to back to Pike's Cantonment to draw rifles, because some of the kids didn't have rifles. They didn't have their own rifles. And he goes on to tell us what kinds of rifles they had. They didn't carry the big military guns. They had Fowlers. These were bird guns, guns that they used at home. So that the story goes on, and it's not just what's here. It goes north of here into Chazy and Champlain, starting with the advance across the border of the British. And by the time September 3rd rolled around, the forces that's when General Moores put out the call for the militia. General Macomb did. And put out the call for the militia. And that was on September the 3rd. And on September the 6th is when he actually issued the orders to the forts here to divide the troops up into essentially blocks of 500, and you're with that fort and you're going to defend it until you die if you have to. And in fact, there's some evidence that had McDonough failed, that there were a group of bateaux that were perched right along the waterfront here, and Moores and Macomb were going to fill those boats with whatever militia and regulars they could and storm the British boats in a last-ditch attempt to make sure that the lake wasn't lost. This story continues, and everyone had a part of this. Vermont did, and down as far as Essex. The Essex militia were here also. And we had the boats that were made from the south here, and the boats that were made in Virgins, and the boats that were made up north, and all along the coastline here, and as far back and up into French Mills area. All those people were involved in this local conflict.
And it seems like every day we got a new tidbit.
A new tidbit.
And hopefully this program will bring some people out of the woodwork, because, we told you a ways back, we didn't know these things existed, or if we did, we didn't know where they were or what was going to happen. This journal is a gold mine.
It is. And there are, the way the story goes with the family, it was at least offered to the Smithsonian some time back, many years ago. But the family did not want to give it to the Smithsonian as an outright gift. For some reason, there was some hesitation to do that. So it has been continued to be passed down through the family. And now at this point, it's somewhere in the mid-Americas, and other parts of the family are scattered here and there. And I have heard from 2 others of the family who are very interested in what we're doing here in Plattsburgh, and we'll keep our fingers crossed. They're interested in our summer celebration here, so maybe we can get them back here.
We want to give them all credit along the way for helping us out. They can bring their families and vacation here.
Please do.
And like some of the descendants of the others whom we have brought back for prior commemorations, we'll bring them. We'll wine them and dine them and love them to death for anything they. And that includes people in this area, because I still believe that there's so much stuff hidden in attics and boxes that people either have lost interest in or don't even know exists. And so I would like to urge all of our viewers to start scrounging around and talk to Grandma and Grandpa and great-grandma and great-grandpa to see what they got in that trunk in the attic.
Indeed.
Because You know, this is fodder. This is what keeps you and I
It is.
going
It is.
day after day.
And there's so many wonderful stories that are right here in Plattsburgh. One parting shot with this: the only testament to the British General Prevost, that exists in the United States is right here in Plattsburgh. And that is the foreword of a book that was written by a British gentleman last year. And the foreword was written by Sir Christopher Prevost, the great-great-great-grandson of the General Prevost, who was placing in the foreword his comments of this wonderful book that was written by a Canadian author, stating that the people here in Plattsburgh are so interested in what's happening and so interested in the conflict and how it happened and why it happened and in moving on and trying to understand it and in giving credit to everyone that was part of it, much as McDonough did when he toasted his enemy as being valorous in the conflict. Here Plattsburgh is doing the same thing some 190 years later. We have a monument to Mr. Prevost right here in Plattsburgh, and there's none that exists in the nation. He was born in New Jersey, by the way. Very interesting.
So we got to thank all the people who are helping us. There are so many volunteers that are coming on board. I think we got a bandwagon finally going, as I've said many times.
I hope so.
I can't wait to see what happens in September of this year. And I really can't wait to see what happens, Lord willing, if we're all around in 2014, because that could be great. Have we got a timetable on that interpretive center? Have we got a broad brush timetable?
Yes, the broad brush is, well, first of all, the feasibility study preliminary results were announced on the 17th of January. And they were presented at the meeting of the Battle of Plattsburgh Association at City Hall on January 17th. The preliminary results are, is it economically feasible for us to create a museum here? The answer is yes. Is it culturally feasible for us to do that? The answer is yes. Is it attractive to more than just our own local population? The answer is yes. And can it be done within a reasonable period of time, meaning several years? And the answer is yes. Those key points are going to be used to go back to the Air Force. And if you remember, the old stone barracks is still owned by the United States Air Force. The results of that survey, they're due back here in March, probably the latter part of March. They will be used to go back to the Air Force and say, we've had the property on hold essentially for a year while this study's been done. The study was funded by the state of New York. And now that we have the conclusion of these wonderful firms that have done the work for us, we're asking the United States government to have faith in what we've done and to turn over that property to us, meaning the old stone barracks, to turn that over to us. Once that happens, we can go back to the state of New York and the federal government and say, here's our project. We now own the building. We are looking to generate the interior or turn the interior into a museum complex, and we need money to come up with the architectural drawings that are needed and to start raising the money to transfer that. In the meantime, we're looking at a different building because we're already out of space. We have the bateau and a tank. If we start to work on that, we need double the space that we have right now. We have this timber. We have the bateau rooster stored in that building. We have 2 timbers for the anchor. The boat crew is going to be working starting in February, generating a representative stock for the confiance anchor. We need space for that. These timbers are immense, Gordy. They're 14 feet long. They're 13 and a half inches deep and 7 and a half inches wide. There are 2 of them. The local school system, the BOCES, or as it's known now, CV Tech, their drafting and CAD classes are going to be generating the drawings for us for the anchor and the anchor stock. The metal shop is going to be generating the iron bands for us. And the Battle of Plattsburgh boat crew is going to be making the stock itself. We're already out of room. We have people bringing us things every day. There's more and more information surfacing every day. So we're looking at a larger building, and we've already started the discussions with Park and the Air Force to look at a larger building. In the meantime, we need an area to stage. We also have the Dean Mosier portrait project, which is being worked on, and we hope that there'll be a significant announcement very soon on that. And Dean called me the other day, and he's chomping at the bit. He's a wonderful guy.
Oh, we jumping at the bit. We spent a lot of time out there with you guys.
Absolutely, and he's ready. And from what I understand, he's squeezing the oils out on his palate right now. So that may be some good news, and we're keeping our fingers crossed for an announcement real soon about that. And as you know, speaking for the Battle of Plattsburgh Association as a trustee, I can tell you that Verizon Communications, the Bell Atlantic people, they have given us a check for $30,000 to start the website development.
Oh,
So
come on.
things are
Has that
starting
been
to
announced
move.
publicly?
It was just announced at that 17th
Oh,
meeting.
wow.
And we do have the check in our hands now, and there should be a significant announcement on it. It's actually been released once, but the work on that has not begun yet. And once the work does start, I'm sure that there'll be more information coming out about that. What that will do is take the Battle of Plattsburgh information, the War of 1812, and put it online on the internet, and also to generate class materials and curriculum that teachers can plug into and download for their classrooms, and they'll be ready-made to order. They can take them off the internet, use them right in their classroom, or modify them for their own curriculum. And again, because of the national significance of the War of 1812 and the story that we have to tell, this is, Winston Churchill, this is the most significant battle of Lake Champlain, i.e. the Royal Savage, Valcour, quote Theodore Roosevelt, this is the most significant battle of the War of 1812. Quote the Canadian author who published last year, and his name escapes me, but the endorsement is by Sir Christopher Prevost. The most important battle of the War of 1812 was here in Plattsburgh, New York, the Champlain Valley. It was not New Orleans. It was not Detroit. It was not Lake Erie. Had they captured Lake Champlain and gone down to New York, as the plans provide for, once the Treaty of Ghent was signed, they would have owned everything to the east of that, which means all of New England would have been British territory. And that didn't happen. This was the most significant battle. Again, there were more British troops here than there were at Detroit or New Orleans. And this was the big enchilada.
You know, we talk about, now the phrase is becoming more popular. I've talked about it for years, and so have you. Heritage tourism.
Oh, yes.
The ultimate goal is to preserve the memory of this whole thing that we've talked about today, and to tell the world about it. And heritage tourism is the name of the game.
It is.
We can envision people planning their vacations 5 years in the future to come and visit all these sites we've talked about, from Chazy to Champlain to Ile-Noir, all the way down and around, and to stop here at our, what we hope will be an amazing interpretive center someday.
Absolutely.
And make it a whole package deal, because heritage tourism is one of the most burgeoning industries in our nation.
The return for the dollar invested is so high, and it can be done year-round. Now, a matter of aside, the city of Plattsburgh is considering many plans, and one of those plans right now is to take the municipal light department out of the Green Street area. This is the mouth of the Saranac River. And also the water pollution control plant, and they're in discussions with CP Rail to remove the rail yard right now. Wouldn't it be nice if you could take that property and turn it into the village of Plattsburgh as it existed, a portion of that property, to turn it
You're
into...
gonna make me drool here.
Absolutely. Turn it into the village of Plattsburgh. In 1812, there were 57 residences here. That's it. There were 11 stores. There were 13 factory-type businesses here. There was a blockhouse. There was a fulling mill. There was a sawmill. There was a grist mill. There were stables. there was a forge. Wouldn't it be nice to put those things down on that opened up area right now, leaving room for period hotel possibly, lots of space for parking. We know that the area down around the end of Dock Street is going to be renewed. We have right now the Plattsburgh Harbor Marina there. We have the Naked Turtle, which is a wonderful establishment here in Plattsburgh. And wouldn't it be interesting, just to plant that seed, if the village of Plattsburgh, 365 days a year, round the clock, 24 hours a day, could be operating as a neighborhood, not just a place to come in and go out from. And along with
Nobody will ever go to Plymouth again.
well, we'd like them to go to Plymouth, but we'd like them to
I'm
come
kidding,
here
of course.
also, yeah.
We have so much to offer. I mean, we've been bursting at the seams here for a long, long time.
Indeed.
And it is, call it a problem or not, for some reason this area has been resistant to change. But now change has got to take place. We've had so much massive change to face ourselves
Yes.
with the fact that Plattsburgh Air Force Base has said goodbye, the fact that much of the Canadian traffic across this area said goodbye. We better adopt some change for the better, or we're going to find ourselves hanging out in the wind. And this is one way to do it. I mean, this to me, this is one of the most exciting ideas I've seen in a long time. What better place than
Indeed.
right there?
Just an idea right now, and I know that others in the city have different ideas for that area, and I believe that some compromise between commercial and business needs and the needs of our local cultural heritage can be met at the same time. Wouldn't it be nice to open up the entire area along the waterfront as a green space where the celebration of the War of 1812, the Battle of Plattsburgh, could be held open to the water so that you could have a naval engagement? And at the Ty-Lee Wharf, as it was known way back then, wouldn't it be nice if period boats could come right up into that, and you could walk from Saley's Ashery, and you could go over to the various studios and into the various shops in the villages, and the Plattsburgh Academy, as it was known as the Academy, the largest building north of Albany, was here in Plattsburgh, right at the end of our street, by the way. Couch Street and Oak is where it was originally. And the courthouse and the blockhouse, and open all that up for a period setting, but to make it a neighborhood so that people actually lived there 24 hours a day. And wouldn't it be nice? And we'll just kind of leave it, wouldn't it be nice? And I think it can happen.
Oh, the North Country's Williamsburg.
Yes, why not? Why not?
So much to think about and so much to do. Again, just before we wrap our program up today, I would like to urge all of our viewers, no matter where you are and when you watch this program, if you have an interest, express it. I mean, it wasn't too long ago, as the crow flies in real time, that this guy was standing with a friend or two in the mall selling those beautiful gold Christmas tree ornaments.
Beautiful too, yeah.
And
That's true.
You did well, and you increased your membership. But the more the
97 new members in 12 hours. 3 hours over 4 nights, and it just shows that the North Country and people from all over the North Country are interested in what's happening, and not only here in Plattsburgh, but this is a North Country treasure that we're talking about. It's a North Country museum. It's the Battle of Plattsburgh Association represents not only Plattsburgh, but all those other communities around us are all part of that. And there are little pieces of the story that need to be told, but taking them all and put them in one place so that scholars years from now can see the entire situation and study it in its proper context. And it's nice to have one place to have all that information together, and it appears that that's going to finally happen. And Lorenzo Haglund, some 40 or 50 years after his death, is finally going to see a museum.
That's terrific. So look in your attic and look in your
Bread box.
bread box. We're going to pause for a minute, and then we're going to wrap it up from 38 Couch Street in Plattsburgh. Somebody gave me a delicious book for Christmas, 2 of them actually. One, the story about a guy named Smith who lived in the woods from time to time with the Adirondack hermit
Oh, yes.
way back when up in the cold river areas of the Adirondack regions. And what an interesting character he was. And another one is a book called Adirondack Firsts. Some people got together and spent a lot of time scouring newspapers and everything else to find out what the first of everything else was in the entire Adirondack region, from the first steamboat on Lake Champlain to the first passenger train to on and on and on and on. It's a most interesting book. Well, they talk about Samuel de Champlain, and how could our program about history of the North Country be complete unless we went all the way back to the guy who allegedly first European to see the Lake Champlain monster in 1609. It was. And Calvin just pointed something out when we stopped the camera to take a deep breath and rest his arm for a second. The 400th anniversary of Samuel de Champlain's trek through this area and up Lake Champlain, which is named after him, will be coming up in 2009. And we mentioned the name Plymouth, and this is years before the Pilgrims came to Plymouth.
Indeed, and there are plans in the making to celebrate that. If you remember, way back in the early part of this century, there was a tercentenary committee. And in fact, I have a volume of that, if you remember, Gordy, and there was a medal struck for that occasion. And it was the tercentenary celebration of the founding of Lake Champlain. And there are plans afoot to have a big celebration here again on that 100th year mark since the last one. Now, where those plans are at this point at the state level, I'm not exactly sure, and possibly that would be a subject for another meeting with you. And I don't have my hand on the people that are aware of the overall schedule for that, but we'll find out who they are.
Yeah, because it's only 8 years away.
8 years, that's
and
correct.
I'm pretty sure we're all going to be around for that time period. I wouldn't dare kick off before then. There's too much going on. I can't wait to see what things you uncover next. You will keep me informed. I'll keep Calvin informed. And we'll keep a whole case of videotape just ready.
Can't wait.
For our next adventure.
Can't wait.
I want to offer my personal thanks for all you've done. I know there have been naysayers along the way, and sometimes when you work so hard at a project, some people who have been doing it for years say, how dare this young upstart uncover so much information in such a short time. But believe me, it's a pleasure for me to see that, and I hope that we can all share in what we've been doing. I want it to be a part of everything. You didn't discover the location of Pikes Cantonment all alone.
Absolutely
You had a
not.
lot of help along the way.
Yes,
And a lot
indeed.
of these things that you've shown us today have had a lot of support from a lot of people. It's
That's
not
correct.
something you can do all by yourself, so it has
No,
to
it
be a
isn't.
community and a North Country effort.
It's a community effort, and the more information that comes forward, the more documents that we uncover, the more information that's passed on from family to family and ultimately gets into our hands. They all become part of the overall puzzle. And remember, we use that allegory of a cloud. You know, sometimes you look at something and it's very, very hazy, and then you get a little piece of information and a little piece of information, and pretty soon you wind up coming into one solid point, and you have what you need to tell the story. And everybody's important in this. Nobody's lost. The information that we get from many places, not only in the North Country, but as we've said here today, they're coming from all across the nation now. You know, we're getting things from California. We're getting things from Mid-America. You know, we're getting things from down south now. They're coming up from Alabama, and in New Jersey, and in New York City, in Canada. You know, I'm working with the papers in the McLaren Library in Canada right now, and the Canadian archives are giving us information that apply to our period of time here. Everybody has a piece of this, and everybody's in this for the long run. It's good for all of us here in the North Country, and that's the answer to the whole thing.
Thanks to all the other media, not only Calvin for starting his first tape-recorded thing like this back in 1983, to my predecessor in this program, the late Bob Venn, who was
Venn.
tremendously interested in history. A lot of those programs are now historical because they've been done years ago.
Yes,
And
indeed.
even the programs that Calvin and I have done together over the last few years, it's fun to go back and view them because some of those people aren't with us anymore.
That's true. They're not. And one of the stories that happened that I happened to hear this week, it was Roger Harwood, a good friend of ours, and Roger was relaying at the meeting on the 17th here that one of the friends of his, a diver for many years, just passed away recently. And the question is, what happened to the information that he had? What happened to any artifacts or pieces of information that he had? What happened to them? And the fact that Roger was saying, as you and I are saying along the way, we have to get that information recorded somewhere. And he was bringing out the point that none of us are getting any younger. And it's nice to be able to pass that on.
So let's do it. We got to wrap up this program before we run out of tape, but I want to thank everybody for viewing and wish you all the best of luck in the future. And who knows where we're going to be next time for our little corner.